welcome to the Explaining History podcast once again, and thanks very much for coming back to us here. It's been a little break for a few days, and I want to talk today about air raid precautions and air raid protection in Britain during the Blitz. Now, a couple of days ago, or maybe last week sometime, I recorded a podcast on the first day of the Blitz, and so this is a kind of like a little series about the social history of the Blitz, I guess you can call it. The book I tend to draw from most is Juliet Gardiner's The Blitz, The British Under Attack, by and large as a historian of the first half of the 20th century in Great Britain. Juliet Gardiner's pretty peerless. She's an extraordinary writer, and I recommend you all absorb her work, particularly her account of Britain in the 1930s. Anyway, as with most things to do with Britain's entry into the Second World War, the policies towards aerial bombardment and protection from bombing changed very quickly and are sort of learned on the job. A lot of the presumptions that were made at the start of the war turn out to be, when they are hit with the cold reality of an actual bombing campaign against Britain, turn out to be obsolete. And so the British improvised. And it's interesting if you read Whitehall documents at the time, particularly from Sir John Anderson, the progenitor of the Anderson Shelter, Home Secretary and person in charge of civil defence for some of the time. And he was very concerned with what he viewed as the kind of like the mass psychology of the mob, and the propensity for people to panic, to act irrationally. These were very popular ideas at the time, and the idea that large groups of people together in one place were to be feared. And there was a kind of a political subtext to all of this, the possibility of anarchy or dangerous revolution breaking out under the bombing. Hitler certainly hoped that would happen. There was no reason to suggest it would do, but Hitler certainly hoped it would. And Anderson's real job was the maintenance of law and order. I did a podcast ages ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, on the subject of evacuation, and the evacuees were extremely badly served in a number of ways. Partly because the Home Office were not really thinking about the needs of children. They were thinking primarily about making sure that society didn't tear itself apart under the pressure of mass bombing. Very soon into the Blitz, within a week, Whitehall itself was being hit. On the 12th of September, Whitehall took a direct hit. The Ministry of Transport was hit, and there were plans that were being put together to move the Cabinet and the Chief of Staff to the basement of the Post Office's research centre in Dollis Hill in northwest London, which would have been quite a long way out of the direct epicentre of the bombing. When Churchill and his wife Clementine, along with Jock Colville, went to have a look at the bunker, Colville wrote of the rooms, "They are impressive but rather forbidding. I suppose if the present intensive bombing continues, we must get used to being troglodytes, i.e. creatures that live underground. I begin to understand what the early Christians must have felt about living in the catacombs." Churchill seldom visited the Dollis Hill site. He spent most of his time at Downing Street and went in the evenings to work underground in the Cabinet War Rooms. The Cabinet War Rooms are a stone's throw from Whitehall. Having been down there several years ago and spoken to the director of the Cabinet War Rooms Museum, I learned that it was about the worst place possible to put it. A direct hit would have destroyed the war rooms, and the only reason why there was never a direct hit is that the Germans didn't know of its existence. But the intensity of bombing over Whitehall actually is not inconceivable that the entire cabinet could well have been killed. The war rooms were defended as well, with a garrison of troops in order to prevent the possibility of a German commando raid, which was always thought might occur. Churchill, in his memoir, said that he directed the war from the cabinet war rooms, but he had a variety of other subterranean sites. The London Underground offices at Down Street station in Mayfair, which was on the Piccadilly line between Dover Street, which is now Green Park, and Hyde Park corner stations. That was closed in 1932, and it was adapted into offices for the Railway Executive Committee. So this was considered to be a safe underground location that not many people knew about, and was slightly removed from Whitehall, and was less likely to be hit. And as far as church was concerned, it had a large dining room where the catering was meant to be very, very good indeed. Despite Britain's rationing, Churchill was able to live very well during the Second World War, and made sure that he never went out without his favoured glass of scotch. Part of number 10 Downing Street, the number 10 annex, actually sat above the war rooms, and the Churchills moved into a ground floor flat there. Churchill also had his own, and Clementine Churchill had their own quarters in the war rooms. The flat wasn't bomb-proof, but it was more likely to avoid a direct strike than number 10 itself. The flat was fitted with steel shutters that could be shut during the raid to prevent glass from being blown in. And it was here, for the most part, that the Churchills lived throughout the war years. One of the biggest questions of bureaucratic management was the question of how to protect the public under a mass bombing campaign. Obviously, the mandarins in Whitehall were aware of the impact of bombing in Spain, in China, and in Abyssinia, but they were not able to really accurately calculate what would happen in Britain. The assumption was that for every ton of high explosives dropped in a congested area, in a built-up area, there would be 50 casualties or thereabouts. The RAF had estimated that 700 tons of bombs would be dropped daily, although for the first few days, in an effort to make sure that there had been a knockout blow to Britain, there would be as many as 950 tons. The Germans might decide to attack for a week-long attrition attack on London and drop 3,500 tons of bombs in the first 24 hours. The maths, therefore, really stacked up in some quite terrifying ways. These are all assumptions, though. The intensity of air attack, as we know, was brought home through Pathé newsreels to alarmed and anxious audiences in Britain throughout the 1930s, seeing Barcelona and places like Bilbao and Guernica obviously being devastated by bombing during the Spanish Civil War. Advance warning was therefore essential. The country was divided up into 111 warning districts, which were based on telephone areas rather than local authority boundaries. Messages about enemy aircraft came from RAF Fighter Command, from the Dowding system that we've already talked about in previous discussions on the Battle of Britain. Telephone lines would cascade messages to warning control centres, and then this would be transmitted in orders of priority to those on the warning list. So government officers would be told first, military bases would be told, the police, civil defence headquarters, fire brigades, and large industrial concerns. Each stage of this alert system was distinguished by a different colour code. A yellow alert meant there was preliminary caution, meaning that enemy planes were estimated to be about 22 minutes flying time. This was confidential, and the public would not have been aware of its receipt, because those who were receiving it were instructed, and I quote, to take the necessary precautions in as unobtrusive way as possible. A red message was action warning. This relayed when planes were 12 minutes away. This was the signal for the police to activate air raid sirens in the district, which sent out the low, horrendously alarming whine, which became louder and louder, a wail. This was an unmistakable alert that a raid was imminent and that they should seek shelter. Fighter Command finally sent the green message, all clear, which meant that raiders were past. and for this siren sounded a steady 2-minute note. One of the great anxieties that the British government had was that mass bombing would disrupt the workings of the British economy, particularly the British war economy. This was going to be a war of mass production, and that war was basically won or lost on the question of mass production. When the British, the Soviets and the Americans together combined began to outproduce the Axis powers several times over, it was a clear indication that the war was unwinnable. So the British needed to keep their workers in factories, and the use of London underground stations to shelter in at night was really discouraged by the British government, because they thought that people wouldn't leave there. They thought that the economy would start to fall apart as a result. It would be the equivalent of having a general strike during a war. So in July 1940, the balance shifts from safety first to production first, to making sure that no matter what, production continued. The unnecessary amount of time that the government thought workers were spending unproductive in air raid shelters, especially during daytime raids, was alarming. The Home Secretary, Sir John Anderson, said that workers engaged in war production should be encouraged to continue at work after a public air raid warning until it is clear that an enemy attack is actually imminent in their neighbourhood. Bear in mind the difference between a yellow and a red warning was 10 minutes. This was made possible by the recruitment of rooftop spotters, who had watching posts on top of all major buildings across the capital and in major cities across the country, and they would alert workers when planes were sufficiently close for them to need to take shelter. In July 1940, another code was introduced, another colour code anyway. This was the Purple Code, which was to towns and cities that were not targets but were beyond the raiders' flight path, and were therefore told to extinguish all lights if it was night, and to follow all air raid protection, air raid precaution procedures, but also to continue working if it was if the recipient of the bombing raid received a red message. Any site along that received a purple message along the route, its workers were permitted to continue working and not to necessarily down tools as a result. Looking at one piece of legislation that was passed in December 1937, the Air Raid Precautions Act, it's interesting that all local authorities were told that they had the responsibility for, and I quote, the protection of persons and property from injury and damage in the event of hostile attacks from the air, and they were required to submit air raid protection schemes for the approval of the government. But there were a few guidelines. There were a couple of model schemes which were sent around for councils to have a look at. But the problem was that nobody actually was sure what would be needed in the event of an air raid attack, and there was little direction from central government. For example, it was unknown to local authorities up and down the country the impact that high explosive bombs would have. It was unknown how far it was likely that poison gas would be used. It was unknown how concentrated the blast would be, and whether shrapnel would be the main concern, or fire, or collapsing buildings. And these are important factors to consider when you're planning how to distribute your manpower, and how you're planning to distribute things like fire brigades and ambulances. The government offered to subsidise the cost of air raid precautions of up to 60 or 75%, almost 85% in boroughs that were poorer. And much of this money, of course, went on the building of air raid shelters. Anderson said that probably the most difficult of all the questions with which local authorities are confronted is that of air raid shelters. Was no understanding of how many there would have to be, how big they would have to be, and the speed with which they had to be constructed was sometimes beyond the means of local authorities. The government assumed two things. One, that most towns and cities would have a large amount of accommodation by which adaptation and strengthening and by use of by the use of sandbags could be made to give reasonable protection, and two, that all householders needed was advice from local officials, and they would generally do what they could to increase the natural protection of their homes. Now, both these assumptions turned out to be wildly inadequate. That people did strengthen their own homes, people did put tape across their windows and dig Anderson shelters in their back gardens. We'll talk about Anderson shelters in due course. But there was immense need for kind of municipal provision of air raid shelters and air raid precautions. And also the assumption that local authorities would have enough spare property anyway, simply to reinforce and to surround with sandbags, that could act as air raid shelters, again, turns out to be inaccurate. Working class housing, such as housing that faced docks for dock workers, or munitions houses that house munitions workers in heavy industrial towns. Many of these houses were built in the mid-19th century very quickly, not particularly well, and were not particularly robust at the best of times, let alone when faced with a bombing campaign. Obviously, a direct hit on a house is going to destroy it. However, the houses in working class districts that didn't face direct hits but experienced a shockwave or the blast were still very, very badly damaged because of the kind of the weakness of the property to begin with. The government didn't like the idea of concentrating people in one place. Better to have them in their own homes protecting themselves than placing them all together in one place where there might be hundreds of frightened people who do all sorts of unpredictable and unwanted things. And also, a shelter, hundreds of people in one place, that shelter can also receive a direct hit. It's particularly unlucky. But I suspect, beneath all this, the discussion about what the state can and cannot do for individuals was really somewhere under the surface. If you knew, you need only to go back to 1914 to find a very different relationship between the state and the individual, a far more removed, classically liberal approach to individuals' not just rights but responsibilities for their own self-care. Places where people tended to gather, cinema theatres for example, or football matches or major sporting events, were briefly shut down at the start of the war, obviously to reopen fairly quickly afterwards. But again, there was this fear that one direct hit could wipe out an entire community, particularly something like a football match, which wasn't attended as they are now by people from across the country, but people from one neighbourhood would go to their local team and support it, and they'd all be there in one bomb, and that's all over. There were public spaces that were earmarked for air raid shelters, essentially a rough kind of slip trench in many ways. But there was a reticence by local authorities to start digging up commons and heaths and parks and turning them into air raid shelters, as it looked rather similar to the trenches of the First World War. And this, of course, would send out a rather unfortunate message about the struggle ahead. The advice to families in the quite famous booklet, The Protection of Your Home Against Air Raids, which was designed to be as non-alarmist as possible, but failed in that really, was that one should create a refuge room at some point in the house, which would be a basement or a cellar, but if none of these were available, any room with solid walls is safer than being out in the open. In the event of an air raid, it says, The head of the household should send all those under his, it was assumed it was a man, care with their respirators to their gas masks to the refuge room and keep them there until he heard the raiders passed, or all clear as it became known as. In 1938, just as the Munich crisis had come to an end, the Home Office sent directives to local authorities in heavily populated areas to construct deep trench shelters for about a tenth of their residents. It was assumed at any one time 10% of people would be within the area and able to use them. Householders were encouraged to build their own air raid shelters in their gardens if they had a garden. So obviously this was a kind of a middle class luxury really for working class families. In tenements it wasn't going to be a possibility. Now, even though the government considered that the proper place to see out an air raid was at home, the reality is that just a majority of people's homes weren't sufficient in order to do that, offering virtually no protection. And so public places and public shelters become far more reliable or far more sought after places for people to try to get to if they can. Obviously, even that's not a possibility for certain members of the population who are far away from these shelters. By the time of the Munich crisis, sandbags had started to be piled up outside government buildings, but for the most part there was almost no structural work being done. When the crisis has passed, I mean, obviously it was thought that bombing might break out during the Munich crisis, that war might actually begin. Once the crisis has passed, work does begin in shoring up basements in municipal buildings and in homes, but it's all fairly unsystematic. There is no kind of central logic to what's happening. And also there's a shortage of materials, and there's a lack of technical information about how thick to lay concrete, how to put in, how strong the steel joists have to be, that sort of thing. And it was at the end of 1938 that the Anderson shelter was introduced. It was called the Standard Steel Shelter, and it was constructed of 800 weight of curved steel sheets, and it was essentially a curved steel exterior carapace roof in the back garden with a dugout trench dug underneath. Anyone earning less than £250 could have their shelter for free, and it was hoped that 10 million people would be protected this way. The distribution begins in February 1939, and when the shelters had been distributed, it was intended that there would be more that would be produced, but for direct sale. They were 6 feet high, 6 feet long, and 4 feet 6 inches wide, and had to be dug 2 feet into the ground and covered with earth or sand. They could accommodate 4 or to squash 6, and they were pretty easy to make. They had to be, you had to be able to do it kind of IKEA style without any actual expertise. There would be no protection from a direct hit. They were not bomb-proof, but they were protection against fragments, debris, and blast. But you needed to have a garden, so they favoured wealthier people. They were all subject to inspection and eventually would have a concrete floor poured in. And the problem, of course, with Anderson shelters is that you couldn't spend the entire night in them because they didn't have a toilet and they were extremely uncomfortable. They got cold, they were liable to be waterlogged as you dug down deeper towards the water table, and many people leave them and to kind of fester in the back garden once the Munich crisis has passed. And in the phony war period of the Second World War, up until 1940, some of these things are waterlogged by the time they actually need to be used. Anderson shelters, of course, only are for people that have a garden, so local authorities in May 1939 when it's clear that war is now a matter of when, not if, began to build public outdoor shelters, blocks of flats where there's no suitable shelter for the residents, and where there was almost nobody eligible for free shelters. The landlord could actually be compelled to build one if he was petitioned by more than 50% of the tenants, and was able to recoup the cost by raising rents. Despite all this, by September 1939 there was a shortfall of about 1 million Anderson shelters. That meant that even in the most dangerous areas, there were people with no shelters, and nothing was offered for sale until October 1939. And there was a discrepancy between the lowest price, £6 and 14 shillings, and £10 and 18 shillings. That meant that it was possible to gain them on kind of credit and hire purchase arrangements. There was limited take-up in these paid-for Anderson shelters, and by April 1940 fewer than 10,000 had been bought, but the basement strengthening programme had barely begun. So that gives you an overview of Britain's rather piecemeal and ad hoc approach to air raid defence on the eve of the war, and it gives you a clue about British preparations on the home front in general. And things change during the years 1940 and 41, as we'll see later on. Anyway, I hope you found that useful. I'll catch you on the next podcast. Do check out our Patreon page and give us a good review on iTunes if you can. Thanks very much for listening. All the best. Bye-bye.